Hey everybody, this is Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be having a little chat about the M60 machine gun. And interestingly enough, despite the fact that the M60 was actually in service for quite a while, especially through the Vietnam War, there aren't a ton of them that I could find in the game of War Thunder. The only ones in the American tech tree that I could immediately dig up were the XM800T and the XM1, and they both use a rather unusual vehicle mount. The XM246 Anti-Air is the only one I could find that actually had a pintle-mounted version of the infantry variant of the machine gun. You might rightfully be wondering at this point, why is he rambling on about the M60? Well, dear viewer, this is me, and this is an M60 machine gun. And you'll notice that I am actually wearing the ACUs that entered service well after the M60 had left service with most units. And there is actually a somewhat unusual story as to how I ended up on a firing range with an M60. So starting this story off, I was actually taking responsibility for my unit's arms room, and unit armorer is one of the additional duties that I would highly recommend you not volunteer for if you ever join the military, because it turns out if you're the unit armorer, every time there's a range you have to wake up early and you have to stay late until every weapon has been checked in. It's actually pretty tedious, and it also means you generally have to go onto ranges and go with the weapons even if you yourself don't have to qualify, so it's a whole lot of very long days and waking up very early in the morning, so you should probably avoid it if at all possible. That being said, this is the army. Sometimes you just get voluntold that you will have an additional duty whether you like it or not, so you don't always get an option. Now, I was going through the arms room with the outgoing armor and checking the various inventory to make sure all of the weapons were accounted for, and I got to the very end of the list of firearms and there were not one, not two, but 4 M60 machine guns, which were a bit of a surprise to me because I was under the impression they were completely out of service with the Army at the time. Now, I know the Navy actually still uses them to this day, but the Army rotated them out around the period of the Gulf War, and the rotation out of service largely completed around the mid-1990s. So the idea of seeing an M60 operational in the arms room was a bit unusual. With that being said, I did check around the arms room real quick, and there were no weapon racks with M60s. We had the pistols, we had the M16s, but we didn't have any machine gun racks. And after conversing with the armorer for a minute, I realized that the giant storage locker right as you walk into the arms room actually had the M60s in it. I unlocked it, opened up the door, and there were just 4 M60s basically in a pile in a locker, along with the barrel bags and the other accoutrements, and of course weapon cleaning kits, other assorted stuff that you would have in an arms room. The outgoing armorer helpfully informed me that we didn't have anybody assigned to the weapons, and he said that basically I shouldn't ever have to worry about them. There was no reason to maintain them because we would never get ammo, and because we would never get ammo, we wouldn't have to worry about anybody shooting them, so none of it really mattered, and I could probably just keep them in the storage locker. And every part of that statement would end up being completely wrong. Flash forward a little bit, and our unit gets a tasker from Post. Now, a lot of people aren't fully aware of this, but militaries actually have a few different pseudo chain of commands involved. You have your actual unit, which is the unit you report to every day and does administrative actions, but then you also have some other chain of commands, like the Post. The base that you're staying on will have its own unit with its own chain of command. Now, you don't necessarily have to do what Post says, but it's usually not a great idea to piss off the people that maintain the facilities that you live and work at. The tasker from Post said they had 1,600 rounds of ammo that were belted for the M60 machine gun, and were looking for anyone with M60s that could fire that ammo off and basically take it off their hands. And after doing a little bit of research, I basically realized that the only unit within about 100 miles that had any M60s were us. So while this was a shotgun email that was sent to a bunch of different units, we were effectively the only unit that could actually respond in the positive. Now, this is the mildly interesting part, in that I actually sent a query back to Post and said, can't a unit with M240s fire them? We don't really use these weapons and they aren't properly maintained. Post helpfully informed me that despite the fact that both the M240 and M60 use 7.62 NATO, the ammo belts used by the M60 and the 240 are actually different enough that the two firearms are not compatible with one another, which I wasn't entirely sure was correct, but Post was both very confident in their reply and very annoyed at me asking a follow-up question, so we decided to just go ahead and answer in the affirmative that we would fire the ammo, because at least on paper we had 4 operational M60s. Now, at this point we actually have to have an internal meeting within our unit because there are several issues with trying to take these weapons out to the range to fire them. The first one is that we have nobody assigned as M60's gunners or assistant gunners and nobody trained on the weapons. Trying to get individuals that are assigned and that can actually go through the training and then also the range was actually kind of difficult given how many people we had deploying and coming back from deployment, so we had to basically consult all of the platoon sergeants and see who would be available for this task. Additionally, there was another issue in that the weapons were not maintained at all, so we would have to take some time out and send them to somebody to actually get them inspected to make sure they were even safe to fire. And the other hurdle was that because our unit had no other machine guns, our unit didn't generally run machine gun ranges, so we would have to find a machine gun range being run by another unit and essentially piggyback on, basically see if they had some extra firing lanes that they weren't using. Now, getting the range set up was actually the easiest because it turns out the brigade runs pretty regular machine gun ranges because none of our units really had a large number of machine guns, so they would just run one and invite everybody. So it wasn't that difficult to find a range that was happening within the next few months that we could basically get tacked onto. That was basically the easiest part of this whole endeavor. Now, after we had secured a spot on the range, my first sergeant comes to me and asks me if we can actually qualify on the M60s. If we're shooting them, we might as well have our gunners qualified on the weapons as well. Now, I actually kind of like this idea because having weird qualifications on your enlisted record brief is the kind of thing I'm actually here for, so getting an M60 qualification when most of them have been removed from service seemed pretty cool. However, after sifting through basically all of the weapon qualifications that I could find, what I ultimately arrived at was there were no authorized qualification tables for the M60 available to the Army at that particular point. Or to put that in other terms, it was impossible to qualify because there was nothing to qualify on. So after discussing it with First Sergeant a little, we decided this would basically just be familiarization fire for the crews to get familiar with the weapons, and we would just shoot the same tables as the M249s. Now, while I'm doing all of this other stuff, I decided to take the 4 M60s up to the post armorer to get him to take a quick look at them, because honestly, I am not even remotely qualified to troubleshoot issues on this weapon at this point, and I want to at least have him do a one-over and give him a clean bill of health before we start proceeding forward. Ultimately, if all of the weapons are found to be non-operational, it doesn't really do us any good. As I am driving up to post armor, it is important to remember we don't have a rack or anything for these M60s, so my plan to take them to the post armor was just to pile them in the back seat of the company van, and this did lead to me getting pulled over by the MPs because it turns out driving around post with a pile of M60s in your back seat is not exactly normal. Although in this particular instance, I was the unit armorer and I was using a government vehicle, so it was technically allowed, but I decided to just go ahead and give them my company's phone number so they could ask the company commander and First Sergeant as many questions they needed to satisfy their curiosity, because honestly, the MPs are kind of douchebags, so I figured I would just cut to the chase and give them the phone number to my chain of command right away. This does bring up one of the funny and also kind of annoying parts about being an armorer, is that the Army has a bunch of very strict regulations on how you are to handle, maintain, and store firearms, and failure to abide by these regulations can actually lead to some fairly serious consequences, which is part of the reason why I would also not recommend ever being a unit armorer. It is a terrible job. There are very serious consequences for failure. Overall, just 0 out of 10, would not recommend. While the M60s were at the post armorer, we had to go through and basically play a giant game of Tetris to see who in the unit was available both for the training and for the range itself. Again, this was harder than it really should have been, and honestly I decided that if I'm going to be doing all of this trouble to get these weapons operational and get them to the range, I'm going to make myself one of the gunners and I'm damn well going to shoot one of them. But after consulting with all of the platoon sergeants, we were able to find 3 other people who would be available as gunners and 4 people that would be available as assistant gunners. On top of that, we also had to go all the way up to brigade to see if anybody knew how the hell to operate an M60. I cannot stress enough that this was actually one of the more annoying parts of this endeavor, because all the training I got as an armorer was on obviously weapons that are currently in service. M249s, M240s, M16s, M9s, also things like the M2 and the Mark 19. I did not get any training at all on the M60. It did take a little bit of searching, but we ultimately managed to find somebody that had been in long enough to actually have operated an M60 and know all the details about operation and also disassembly and cleaning, and arrange for a training session so that I could get trained on the weapon to the point where I could train all the other crews to operate their weapon as well, because basically all 8 people firing the weapons had to know how to do it, and on top of that I had to be very familiar with the M60 in general because I was going to be on the range, and if we had any issues I was going to be the one troubleshooting them. So after making all those arrangements, I go back to the post armor, I pick up the M60s, and the post armor helpfully informs me that one of the M60s has a damaged firing pin and is not operational, and then I proceed to ask him how long it will take to get a replacement part. And you would honestly think by this individual's reaction that I had just asked to bang his wife, and he proceeded to then inform me that there are no parts for the M60 in the entire supply chain. Basically, if it's broke, it's not getting fixed and it's not getting replaced anytime soon. So one of our 4 weapons was just down. We were not shooting it. We did decide to train the crew for that M60 anyway, so we had some replacements in case anything went wrong, however. With us now in possession of the M60s, I went to the arms room with the individual who actually knew how to operate the M60s, and we spent basically an entire afternoon going over all of the nuances of this weapon, left, right, top, bottom, basically how you take it apart, how you fire it, manual of arms, corrective action, all that good stuff, because not only would I have to operate it, but I would have to train other people how to operate it, and I would also have to perform any troubleshooting should there be any damage to the weapons on the range. So this was a pretty lengthy session of easily a few hours. Now, I will also note that during this session, we got to the point where you discussed the barrel changes on the M60, and I actually had watched the History Channel a fair bit as a kid, and I remembered something in a documentary about the M60 that I was thinking, there's no way this could be true. So I had to do some quick checking. Basically, I went to the locker and grabbed the barrel bag, and if you look at this spare barrel I have on the screen, you'll see a few different design flaws. The first one is that the bipod is actually directly mounted to the barrel. This has 2 rather significant problems because number 1, it makes the spare barrels incredibly heavy because each one also includes a bipod. So the barrel pegs were not exactly light. On top of that, because the bipod is on the barrel itself, essentially if you're in the prone position, what you have to do is you have to lift the weapon up, take the barrel out, and then you have to hold the weapon up so that your assistant gunner can basically gingerly insert it. It's a very awkward process because you have to completely break position to change barrels, and this is why most modern machine guns actually have the bipod mounted to the frame of the weapon and not directly to the barrel, because if you have to do a barrel change in that instance, you just keep it in the prone position pointed where the bad guys are, change the barrel out, put a new one in, and you're good to go. Whereas the M60 is obviously a lot more awkward. But there's another interesting feature about this spare barrel. Where do you grab it? If you assume both the barrel and the gas system are fairly warm and you don't actually want to touch it with your bare hands, you would think the bipod, but you can't grab it from the bipod because the bipod on this is remarkably flimsy. It looks more sturdy than it actually is. And this is where we get to the History Channel documentary, because in the documentary they said the prescribed way to do it was to take an asbestos oven mitt, essentially, grab the hot barrel with the glove, and then put the new barrel on. And when I was checking the barrel bags, I did indeed notice not only do we have spare barrels and also the manual, we also had a spare 50-year-old asbestos glove. So yes, the barrel change procedure for the M60 per the manual is to unlock the barrel, have your assistant gunner put on the glove, have them use the glove to grab the hot barrel with nothing else between them and the hot barrel except for the glove, and then put a new barrel on before locking it back in place. In fact, this procedure is actually demonstrated pretty well by this photograph, although in this photograph the M60 is on a tripod so the gunner isn't having to manually hold it. Now, after conferring a bit with the first sergeant on this procedure, we basically concluded that we weren't really going to use the 50-year-old asbestos oven mitts due to obviously safety and health concerns. Now, in terms of the operation of the M60, there is one interesting detail that you can use to tell if a video game or movie is fudging the reload on the weapon. A lot of video games and movies like to have the character dramatically slam the feed tray cover down and then rack the bolt. However, on the M60, this specific course of action is mechanically impossible. On the left in this photo is actually the feed tray of an M60, and you can see in the M60 itself there is a little knob on top of the bolt, and then on top of the feed tray there is a rail. Now what's supposed to happen is the knob is supposed to go in this rail, and the reason why there's a bend in the rail is because as the knob goes up it actually pushes the rail slightly to the side, and that's how the M60 cycles belts of ammo through the weapon. So you need that knob and that rail to be intact. However, if you look at the knob when it's all the way forward and the rail, you'll notice that there's a small problem, because if you leave the bolt forward and then open the feed tray, the rail in the top will actually be all the way to the side. So as soon as you pop it open, the rail will snap in place, which if you do it enough can damage it. That's actually not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that if you leave the bolt all the way forward and you try to drop the feed tray, instead of engaging with the rail, that little knob is going to be right here, right next to the rail. So if you then proceed to try to rack the bolt back, you're just going to to slam that knob into the rail and potentially catastrophically damage the weapon. At a bare minimum, you're not going to be able to actually rack the weapon by doing this. So when operating the M60, you have to keep the bolt all the way to the rear whenever you're going to open up the feed tray or close the feed tray. So the reload in order is you lock the bolt to the rear, open the feed tray, clear any spare brass or belt lengths that may still be in the weapon, drop a new belt in, close the feed tray, and now you're good to go. There are no further steps. Once you close that feed tray cover, as long as the bolt is to the rear, you're ready to fire. Now this also brings us to a fun little quirk of the M60. The M60 has a rather unusual feature in that the main operating rod or op rod actually has the bolt sitting on top of it and rotated under spring tension, and what keeps the bolt from rotating off of the op rod is the body of the gun just physically holds it in place. And what this means is when you take the butt off the weapon for disassembly and you take the bolt and op rod out, you have to firmly grasp both the bolt and the op rod and hold them together until you get them out of the weapon, because if you don't, the second the bolt is clear of the body of the M60, what's going to happen is it's going to rotate under all of that spring tension and go flying across the room. And as I am explaining this step to this group of privates who is getting ready to operate the M60s, I look up and I see a bolt of an M60 flying across the arms room before it clatters onto a concrete floor. The entire room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop, and I just gave a quick sigh, carefully put my parts down, walked across the room, grabbed the bolt, walked up to the private, handed it to the private, and said, "Please don't do that again." Basically, we can't get any replacement parts, so if this bolt is broken, it's just gonna be broken. But that little snafu aside, we have completed all of our steps on the quest to get the M60s ready to expend 1600 rounds of ammo, so let's go to the range. So we go to the range, and the first thing we do is I go to the ammo point and I start breaking the M60 ammo into the prescribed belts, because each table essentially has an amount of ammo that you're supposed to take onto the table, and you shoot that. And it doesn't take more than maybe a minute on the firing line to get a ceasefire on the range, and all I can think to myself when this happens is, please don't let it be one of the M60s. And guess what? It was one of the M60s. The M60 crew comes to the ammo point with the weapon, says it is not cycling rounds properly, and I decide to look over it. I don't really know what I'm looking at. I don't have enough experience with the M60 to really know how to troubleshoot these kind of problems, but I do have a decent amount of knowledge of machine guns in general, and I did at least have the class where I got to see how all the parts interact with each other, so maybe we can figure out the problem. And it turns out the problem was exceptionally easy. The main drive spring was actually broken. In fact, it looked a little weird when I opened it up, and when I took it off the guide, it essentially fell to the ground in two separate pieces. It essentially snapped in half and then wound up on itself, so that entire guide spring was no longer available for the M60, which meant that we now had a whopping 2 operational weapons and still around 1600 rounds of ammo to shoot. So I'm next up on the firing line. I take my M60 out, fire the first burst, and the weapon keeps firing. Without my finger on the trigger, the weapon proceeds to burn through the entire 75 round belt. In firearm circles, when a weapon continues firing without any input from the operator, this is commonly referred to as a runaway gun. This is most common on things like open bolt machine guns, but can sometimes happen on other models of weapon. So now I get to have a little chat and powwow with my first sergeant, range control, and the range NCO for this particular range. So as it stands, we basically have 3 different options. The first option is we know we have one operational M60, or at least we suspect we do. We haven't actually fired it yet, and we could try to fire all 1600 rounds, or about 1500 at this point, through that weapon. This is not exactly an encouraging prospect given that we've already had 3 failures. The other option is that we can try to Frankenstein parts from the broken M60s into a functional M60, which has its own set of risks. Now, my solution, and the third solution, was to simply put the runaway gun on the range. Now, this might sound a little insane, but the M60 has a pretty stable bipod. It's a reasonably heavy weapon, so it absorbs the recoil pretty well, because obviously the heavier the weapon, the less recoil you're going to feel. The butt pad also has a nice little metal plate you can flip out to tuck it in your shoulder. Ultimately, if you're in a prone supported position, it doesn't really matter if the weapon keeps shooting, it's not going to go anywhere. So my rationale, as I explained it to the first sergeant and basically everyone else gathered, was that the worst case scenario is that I expend my ammo belt early and I'm basically just sitting there on my hands while everybody else finishes up the table. And lo and behold, the response from my first sergeant is, and I quote, Our mission is to expend ammo. A machine gun that does not stop firing is not an obstacle to that mission. And that was it. We basically came to the conclusion that the safest quote-unquote way to do this was to put a known runaway gun on the firing line. And I got to run it. All told, I ended up cycling about 700 rounds through a runaway gun, and I did try to diagnose what the issue it is. I'm pretty sure it was an issue with the main sear, that when you release the trigger, it moves up to engage with the bolt to stop it from moving, and I figured that the sear had actually gotten worn to the point where it wasn't actually catching, but every now and then the bolt would actually catch correctly and would stop firing when you release the trigger or a few rounds after you release the trigger, so I figured what was essentially happening was the bolt was simply building up so much momentum that the sear couldn't actually stop it, but if you fired a light enough burst or if it slammed itself into the sear enough, then it might actually stop on its own sometimes. But again, I don't really know enough about the M60, so that was just kind of my shot in the dark as to what might be going on with the weapon. Now, one fun piece of trivia for anybody who's not in the military is the ranges are actually quite large, and some units will take it as a training opportunity to basically ruck march to their assigned range. So there was a unit that was ruck marching behind us, and while I was firing, somebody decided it would be a great idea to take the bullhorn and shout out 3 to 5 round burst, hua, because doctrinally you're supposed to fire in 3 to 5 round bursts. Now at this point I was both kind of tired and kind of annoyed, so I looked over my shoulder and shouted as my weapon is firing on its own, 35 round burst, hua. In the military, there's an expression called stay in your lane. This is basically when you're on the firing line, you pay attention to your targets, and if your battle buddy next to you isn't hitting their targets, that's an issue between them and their chain of command. The term stay in your lane basically means worry about yourself, don't worry about me, and this is the perfect situation to encapsulate that. The only person on this range that didn't actually know what was going on was the douchebag who was yelling at me. Now, with all of that dumpster fire that happens, it turns out our only mission for this day was to fire all 1,600 rounds of ammo, and that mission was accomplished. We completed our mission because our mission didn't say anything about the state of the M60s after the ammo had been expended, so I consider that an unqualified success. As soon as we got back to the arms room, I gave the M60s a quick once-over, made a post-it note detailing all of the faults for whatever poor bastard would have to get these M60s next, threw them in the locker, and did not touch them again for the entire time I was with that unit. As far as the experience of shooting the M60 itself, it was fine, nothing terribly remarkable. It's just a machine gun, it does normal stuff that a machine gun can do. I will say the sights on it are uniquely bad. I was actually playing Call of Duty a lot at the time, and the Call of Duty M60 had very obstructive sights, and it turns out that is very true to real life. It's incredibly easy to lose your sight picture after only the first few bullets, at least on the standard M60 sights, so I ended up dropping them after the first table. Probably the best part about learning about the M60 and getting to fire it was actually that I get to tell you about all of the fun and stupid quirks of this particular weapon's design, because it is a bafflingly bad design in several key areas. With that being said, the M60 is kind of an iconic weapon. It's appeared in basically every Vietnam War movie. You have movies like Full Metal Jacket, Rambo, We Were Soldiers, and even goes into some modern military movies. You have movies like Black Hawk Down, a personal favorite where there is an M60 gunner, and it even makes an appearance in Star Wars in the Rogue One sequence where you have the door gunner. The door gunner is actually using a dressed up M60. If you look really closely, you can actually see the heat shield in the front of the barrel. So I will say that while from a mechanical standpoint, the M60 is a pretty unremarkable weapon to use, it does at least have a pretty substantial historical cachet and is a very easily recognizable weapon, so getting to shoot one is a nice little bucket list thing, and of course the adventure to get to the point where I could shoot one is a whole nice little story that I can tell to you guys, so all of that ended up working out pretty well. And this concludes the second installment of what we're going to call the channel lore. Again, if you guys like this video, keep letting me know in the comments, I'll keep making them. There is quite a few other stories that I could share, and believe me when I say I am easing you into the military stuff. It's actually going to get pretty unhinged if we go too deep into the lore, but hey, if that's what you guys want, I can certainly do it. If you liked the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.